Comfort doesn't come from a place, Amara began, pausing to let each word sink in. It comes from the people who create it. Unlike you, I don't pick and choose who gets to smile at. I don't decide who's worthy and who's not based on how they look. That's your job, I guess. But guess what? At the end of the story, leave your opinion below, and don't forget to subscribe, and we'll continue. Amara Williams leaned back in her plush first-class seat, feeling the tension of the last few weeks slowly drain from her body. The train pulled smoothly out of Chicago Station, taking her on a long-awaited journey to New York. The city lights flashed past the window, dissolving into the February gloom, and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulled her, promising rare hours of peace. For the first time in months, she allowed herself the luxury of a first-class ticket. After a grueling trial in which she, a black lawyer with 10 years of experience, defended the rights of a family who had lost their home due to the machinations of a developer, this was a well-deserved reward. She wanted peace, comfort, and the opportunity to simply be herself without a mask, without the need to prove her competence. The first-class car was almost empty. Dim lights fell softly on the cream walls, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the small counter at the end of the aisle. Amara took off her coat, carefully folding it on the seat next to her, and took a book from her bag. The Invisible Man, by Ralph Ellison. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but this book always reminded her why she chose her profession. Around her neck glittered a thin chain with a pendant, a gift from her grandmother, engraved with the initials A.W. and a tiny symbol of the scales of justice. She ran her finger over the pendant, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It was her talisman, her anchor. The passengers around her were quiet. An elderly couple leafed through magazines. A man in an expensive suit typed something on a laptop, and a young woman with headphones stared out the window, as if hypnotized by the scenery. Amara took a deep breath, savoring the moment. She deserved it. After months of sleepless nights, negotiations, and furious arguments in the courtroom, she could finally exhale. She was 35, and over the years she had learned to appreciate such moments when you can just sit there, without justifying yourself or proving that you have the right to be here. The suburbs flashed past the window, the houses became less numerous, and the darkness became thicker. The train rocked gently, and Amara closed her eyes, listening to the sounds, the muffled hum of the engine, the occasional footstep in the aisle, the rustle of pages. She didn't notice the conductor enter the carriage. The woman moved confidently, with the businesslike grace that comes from someone accustomed to being in control. Her steps were soft but purposeful, and when she stopped at the elderly couple's seat, her voice was warm, almost gentle. "Good evening. How can I help you? Perhaps I can get you some tea? We have a wonderful herbal infusion." The couple smiled and thanked her, and the conductor nodded and moved on. Amara opened her eyes, watching the scene out of the corner of her eye. She liked watching people. Their gestures, intonations, small habits gave away more than words. She was used to reading between the lines. It was part of her job. The conductor approached the man in the suit, exchanged a few words with him, and he nodded and returned to his laptop. Everything seemed perfectly coordinated, like a well-rehearsed performance. And then the attendant turned to Amara. Her gaze changed. The smile that had been on her face just a moment earlier was gone, replaced by something cold, almost appraising. Amara felt it instantly, the familiar sensation of being viewed not as a person, but as an object to be classified. She sat up straighter in her seat, clutching the book in her hands involuntarily. The attendant stopped 2 steps away, crossing her arms over her chest. Her uniform was impeccable, a navy blue skirt, a white blouse, and neatly styled blonde hair. Her name tag read, Catherine Blake. "Good evening," Catherine began, but her voice lacked the warmth it conveyed to others. "Are you in the wrong carriage, perhaps?" Amara blinked. The question hung in the air, sharp as a needle. She knew the tone. It was unmistakable for genuine confusion. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. She looked up slowly, meeting Catherine's gaze. Something inside her tensed, but she forced herself to smile. A thin, polite smile that had steel behind it. "No, I'm in my seat," she said calmly, setting her book on her lap. "First class, seat 4A. I can show you my ticket if you need me." Catherine inclined her head slightly, as if she hadn't heard. Her lips twitched, but the smile didn't appear. "Oh, don't worry," she said, a note of condescension creeping into her voice. "Just checking. We have all sorts of things here." She stood there for a second longer, as if expecting Amara to start making excuses, then turned and walked away toward the coffee counter. Amara watched her go, her pulse quickening. All sorts. The word echoed in her mind, leaving a bitter taste. She knew it was just the beginning. Things like that never ended with a single sentence. The lights of a small town flickered outside the window, and the train swayed slightly on a curve. Amara opened her book, but her eyes slid over the lines, not catching on to the words. She tried to recapture the feeling of calm that had started the trip, but it was slipping away like smoke. The chain around her neck suddenly felt heavier, the pendant cold against her skin. She knew Catherine would come back. People like her always did. Amara glanced at her watch. The trip had just begun, almost 12 hours ahead. She could complain, she could ignore it, but something told her this was not the end. The train was quiet, too quiet, and she saw the man in the suit glance at her briefly before turning back to his screen. Something was brewing, and she could feel it in her skin. When Catherine reappeared in the aisle, she was holding a tray of cups, but her gaze was fixed on Amara. And at that moment, there was a soft click as someone in the car turned on a phone camera. Amara opened her book again, forcing herself to focus on the text, but Ellison's words, "I'm invisible, you see, simply because people refuse to see me," now sounded like a prophecy. She could feel the gazes, albeit furtively, of the passengers around her. The man in the suit, whose fingers hovered over the keyboard, the older couple, whose whispers grew slightly louder, and even the girl with headphones, whose head turned slightly in her direction. The car, a moment ago a cozy refuge, now felt like a stage on which she had unwittingly become the main character. Catherine returned, as Amara expected. The tray of cups clinked softly as she set it down on the counter, but instead of passing drinks, the attendant came straight to her. Her steps were measured, almost theatrical, and the icy smile was back on her face, like a mask she wore for the audience. Amara closed the book, resting it on her lap, and sat up straight, bracing herself for what was coming. She knew this scenario. It had been played out before her dozens of times in courts, offices, shops. But here on the train, where all she wanted was peace, it felt especially personal. "Can I see your ticket?" Catherine asked, holding out her hand. Her voice was even, but there was a note in it that Amara recognized immediately, a mixture of arrogance and false politeness. Amara took her time. She slowly pulled her phone out of her coat pocket, opened the app, and handed it to Catherine, showing her the e-ticket. The screen clearly read, "First class, carriage 2, seat 4A." She stared at the conductor, eyes locked, and waited. Catherine picked up the phone with mild irritation, her perfectly manicured fingers lingering on the device a little too long. She studied the ticket, head tilted, as if searching for an invisible mistake, a forgery, anything that would justify her tone. She finally said, handing the phone back. "It's okay. Just checking." "Of course," Amara said, her voice calm but steely. "I understand that order is important." Catherine narrowed her eyes slightly, but said nothing. She turned to leave, then stopped, glancing over her shoulder. "You know," she added, lowering her voice, "first class is a special place. We try to make everyone comfortable." The words hung in the air like smoke, slowly spreading through the carriage. Amara felt the familiar anger boiling inside her, but she clutched the pendant around her neck, forcing her breathing to slow. She could have responded, she could have torn that sentence apart, as she had in the courtroom, but instead, she simply nodded. "Bye." Let Catherine think she had won this little game. The attendant moved to the counter, serving tea to an older couple. Her voice was sweet as honey again, her smile as genuine as it could be for someone who had just challenged someone else's right to a seat. Amara stared out the window, where the darkness now seemed endless, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew it wasn't over. Someone like Catherine didn't stop at hints. And then she heard a whisper. The older man of the couple, sitting closer to the aisle, leaned toward his wife and muttered something, glancing at Amara. She couldn't hear the words, but the tone was familiar, condescending, slightly annoyed. His wife nodded, adjusting her glasses, and went back to her magazine. Amara clutched the book a little tighter. Her fingers trembled, but she forced herself to open the page and pretend to read. Let them think she didn't notice. Let them think she was giving in. But then something unexpected happened. The girl with headphones, sitting 2 rows away, took them off and turned to look at Amara. Her eyes met hers, bright green and curious. She was young, maybe 20, with short brown hair and a piercing in her eyebrow. She was holding a phone and was clearly typing something. Amara saw the corner of her mouth twitch into a small smile, not mocking, but almost sympathetic. "That was rude," the girl said quietly, so only Amara could hear. "She's not even hiding it, is she?" Amara blinked, not expecting it. She wasn't used to having allies in situations like this. Usually people either looked away or joined in the condemnation. But this girl was looking at her with something like respect. "Yes," Amara replied, lowering her voice as well. "She's not hiding it. But I'm used to it." The girl shook her head, her fingers moving across the screen again. "You shouldn't get used to it," she said, and there was something firm, almost belligerent, in her tone. "I'm Leah, by the way." "Amara." She nodded, feeling the tension in her chest ease a little. Leah's smile widened, but her gaze slid to Catherine, who was now standing at the counter, her back to them, pouring coffee. Amara saw Leah raise her phone, as if to film something, but then lower it, as if changing her mind. "Bye." Catherine turned, cup in hand, and her eyes found Amara again. She moved toward them, but this time her steps were faster, her smile sharper. Amara realized that the pause was over. Whatever the hostess had planned, she was going to see it through. Catherine stopped at Amara's chair, setting her cup on the small table in front of her, even though Amara hadn't ordered anything. The gesture was almost defiant, like a challenge. The attendant leaned a little closer, and her voice became quieter, but no less venomous. "If you need anything, let me know. We're here for your convenience." Amara looked at the cup, then at Catherine. There was a glint in her eyes, not anger, but something cold and calculating. She knew it was a trap, but she hadn't yet decided how to play it. Leah, sitting nearby, picked up her phone, and this time the camera was clearly on. Catherine didn't notice, but Amara did. The train lurched around a curve, and somewhere in the distance a whistle blared. The tension in the car was almost palpable. Amara glanced at the coffee cup in front of her, then looked up at Catherine. The conductor stood still, arms crossed, her smile taut as a string about to snap. The car was silent, even the rustle of pages and the click of keys, as if everyone was waiting for what would happen next. Amara felt that pressure, familiar as an old scar, the looks, the silent tension, the anticipation of her reaction. She could have said nothing, could have swallowed this next pill, but something inside her snapped. "Not today." "I didn't order coffee," she said calmly, but her voice resonated in the silence of the car like the rap of a gavel in a courtroom. "And to be honest, I'm not sure I want to take anything from you after you decided to double-check my ticket." Catherine blinked, clearly not expecting a rebuff. Her smile faltered, but she quickly composed herself, sitting up straighter with an air of injured innocence. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, raising her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "We have rules. I have to make sure everyone is in their seats." "Rules?" Amara repeated, nodding slowly. She set her book down on the table next to her cup, her movements deliberate, almost theatrical. Interesting. You didn't check the tickets of the old couple across the way. Or the man with the laptop, either. Just me. Why? The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Catherine opened her mouth to answer, but Amara didn't give her a chance. No, wait, she continued, her voice rising slightly but still as steady as a blade. You said first class was a special place. What did you mean? That it wasn't a place for people like me? The train had gone so quiet that you could hear the train creaking slightly on the tracks. Leah, sitting 2 rows away, raised her phone higher, her camera now openly recording the proceedings. Catherine caught the movement out of the corner of her eye and turned sharply. What are you doing? She snapped, her voice breaking into a sharp note. This is private space. You have no right to film. This is public transportation. Leah replied, not lowering her phone. Her tone was firm, with a hint of mockery. And I have every right to record if I see something wrong. Catherine paled, but then turned back to Amara, as if deciding that the real threat was still in front of her. I didn't mean to offend you, she said, but her words sounded as false as a cheap melody. There are just misunderstandings. First class isn't for everyone, you know. Not for everyone, Amara repeated, and now there was a hint of anger in her voice, restrained but palpable. You're repeating yourself, Catherine. Perhaps you could just tell me what you mean. That I don't meet your first-class standards? Because of what? My profession? My clothes? Or maybe the color of my skin? The words hit like a whip. Catherine took a half-step back, her face momentarily losing its mask of professionalism, revealing something cold and hostile. She pressed her lips together, but before she could respond, another voice broke into the conversation. I'm sorry, but this is too much, said the older man from the couple opposite him. He put down his magazine and looked at Catherine with obvious irritation. His voice was low, with a slight accent that betrayed a rich life. I take this train every month, and I've never seen conductors behave like this. She showed her ticket. Leave her alone. Catherine turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. She clearly hadn't expected one of her own. A white man in an expensive coat, with graying temples and a disdainful look to turn against her. Amara looked at him too, feeling a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She knew that such allies were temporary, but now it was to her advantage. Sir, this is just a test, Catherine began, but the man raised his hand, interrupting her. I heard everything. This is not a test, it's personal. And you are a disgrace to this car with your rules. He emphasized the last word with sarcasm, leaning back in his seat. Catherine clenched her fists, her cheeks flushing slightly. She glanced at Amara, then at Leah, whose phone was still pointed at her, and finally at the other passengers. The man with the laptop was now also looking, raising an eyebrow, and the girl with the headphones was clearly holding back a smile. The car was no longer her territory. First class is becoming too accessible these days, Catherine muttered, almost under her breath, but loud enough for her to be heard. It was her last outburst, and it sounded like a confession. Amara stood up. She was half a head taller than Catherine, and in that moment her presence filled the space. Her necklace and pendant glinted in the light of the lamps, a reminder of who she was and what she stood for. Approachable? She asked, her voice loud now, but not shouty, the voice of a lawyer accustomed to cutting the truth to pieces. I earned this job. Every hour in court, every case I won for people the likes of you consider unapproachable. And you? You just serve coffee and decide who deserves a smile. So who's out of place here? Catherine opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Her gaze darted from Leah to the older man, then fell to the floor. She was trapped, and everyone could see it. Leah lowered her phone for a second, catching Amara's eye. It's already viral, she said quietly, a spark in her eyes. I'll upload it if you tell me. Amara nodded, barely perceptibly. She felt the anger inside her mingle with something else, triumph, but bitter. She had won this round, but why did she have to fight at all? Catherine retreated to the counter, her movements sharp, like a cornered animal. She grabbed the tray and began to move things around, but it was clear she was just stalling for time. The car hummed, whispers, glances, a slight giggle from the girl in the headphones. Amara was still standing, her pulse pounding in her temples. She knew this wasn't the end. Catherine wasn't one to give up quietly. And then another person appeared in the aisle, a man in uniform, with a tired face and a badge that said, "Senior Conductor." He looked at Catherine, then at Amara, and frowned. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low as a distant train whistle. The senior conductor, whose name tag read James Reed, stopped in the middle of the aisle, his gaze flickering from Catherine to Amara and back again. The car was quiet again, but the tension was different now, not just curiosity, but anticipation. Catherine sat up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and spoke quickly, ahead of everyone else. "We've had a bit of a misunderstanding, James," she said, her voice sweetly polite, but with a taut twitch. "The passenger is a little upset. I was just trying to smooth things over." Amara raised an eyebrow, but remained where she was, crossing her arms. She'd seen this move a dozen times. Shift the blame, soften the tone, make the one who dared to object seem the victim. James looked at her, then at Catherine, and his frown deepened. "Upset?" he asked, his voice low and tired, like someone who had seen too much drama in a shift. "Because of what?" Catherine opened her mouth, but Amara decided she had enough of her game. She stepped forward, her movements calm, but with power in every gesture. "Because your colleague double-checked my ticket even though I was in my seat," she began, her voice even but cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Because she said first class was not for everyone and getting too accessible. And because she still thinks I have to justify my presence here." James glanced at Catherine, his eyebrows rising. The older man who had supported Amara earlier cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "It was," he added, putting the magazine down. She was unprofessional. I would say insulting. Catherine's face went white, her fingers tightening on the edge of the tray she was still holding. "That's not true," she blurted out. "I was just keeping order." She started raising her voice. Leah, who was holding the phone, snorted loudly enough for everyone to hear. She held up the device, showing the screen to James. "I have it all recorded," she said, her voice ringing with barely concealed triumph. "Would you like to see it? It shows who was raising their voice, and who was just trying to drink their coffee in peace." James nodded, gesturing for Leah to come over. Catherine took a step back, her eyes darting between the senior handler and the phone like a cornered animal. But before Leah could hand over the device, Catherine sat up straight and took a deep breath, as if deciding to change tactics. "Okay," she said, her voice lower, but with a new edge to it, venomous, almost menacing. "If you want to put on a show, I'll leave. But maybe you should ask yourself, miss, if you wouldn't be more comfortable in the general car? It's easier to find common ground there, you know." The words dropped like a stone into water, sending a ripple of shock through the car. The older man shook his head, the girl with the headphones smirked openly, and the man with the laptop, who had been silent until then, finally looked up from the screen, casting a look of contempt at Catherine. Amara felt the anger inside her flare brighter, but she forced herself to wait. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to realize that Catherine had just said out loud what she had only hinted at before. She turned slowly to face the attendant, her eyes narrowing, but her voice calm, cold as steel. "Comfort isn't about the place," Amara began, pausing to let each word sink in. "It's about the people who create it. Unlike you, I don't pick and choose who gets to smile at. I don't decide who's worthy and who's not based on how they look. That's your job, I guess. But you know what? You're not very good at it." Catherine froze. Her lips twitched, but she couldn't think of anything to say. For the first time all evening, her mask cracked, revealing confusion and anger. James cleared his throat, stepping closer. "Catherine," he said, and his tone left no doubt that the conversation was over. "Go to the service bay. We'll figure it out." But Leah wasn't going to stop. She raised the phone higher, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. "1 second, she said, looking at Amara. "I'm already uploading it. It needs to be online. Let everyone see how they create comfort here." Catherine turned on her sharply, her voice breaking into a scream. "You can't do this. This is my job, my reputation." "And mine?" Amara asked quietly, her words sharper than any scream. "Did you think about my reputation when you decided I wasn't worthy of this car?" Catherine didn't answer. She dropped the tray on the counter, the cups clinking, and walked quickly out of the car. James watched her go, then turned to Amara. "I apologize," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "This shouldn't have happened. I'll talk to her." Amara nodded, but said nothing. She sat back in her seat, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Leah lowered her phone, finishing loading it, and looked at her with a small smile. "It's already on Twitter," she said. Hashtag first class for everyone. I think they'll be talking about it in the morning." Amara looked at her, then at her reflection in the dark window. The train sped forward, but something inside her stopped. She had won, but the victory left a bitter taste. Catherine disappeared through the carriage door, but the silence did not return. Passengers began to whisper. Someone took out their phone to check social media, and an older man opened a magazine again, but his gaze kept returning to Amara. James followed Catherine, promising to look into it, but a few minutes later the carriage door opened again. Catherine returned, without a tray, without a smile, but with something in her hands. It was a small card, which she tossed on the table in front of Amara. "This is for you," she said, her voice full of venom. "A compliment from the company. Enjoy your trip," the card said. "Free drink." Amara looked at it, then at Catherine, and felt the anger well up inside her again. This was not capitulation. This was revenge. Amara looked at the card with the words, "Free drink," written on it, lying on the table in front of her, and smiled faintly. It was not a gesture of reconciliation, but a final sting, a pathetic attempt by Catherine to save face, as if a cup of coffee could undo everything that had happened. She did not touch it, but left it there, a silent reproach. The carriage gradually came to life. The passengers' whispers grew louder. Someone took out their phone, checking social networks, and Leah, sitting 2 rows away, was already scrolling through the screen, her eyes shining with excitement. "It's taking off," she said, without looking out from her phone. 3,000 views in 5 minutes. The hashtag first class for everyone is already trending. People are writing that this is not the first time with this company." Amara nodded, but her thoughts were somewhere far away. She felt the looks not like before, not judgmental, but curious, mixed with something like respect. The older man who supported her was now looking openly. His wife whispered something to him, and he nodded. The girl with the headphones put them in her bag, and now also immersed herself in the phone, occasionally throwing light smiles at Amara. Even the man with the laptop, who had seemed indifferent until then, closed the device and looked at her as if noticing her for the first time. But not all the looks were kind. Across the aisle sat a middle-aged woman whom Amara had not noticed before. She had entered later, taking the window seat. Her lips were pursed, and her eyes narrowed to a thin slit when they met Amara's gaze. She said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than words. Amara knew the type, the ones who don't interfere, but secretly enjoy others' humiliation, as long as it doesn't affect them. The carriage door opened again and James, the senior conductor, walked in. His expression was grimmer than before, and Catherine loomed behind him, but she remained at the entrance, hesitating to step further. James stopped at Amara's table and cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "Miss Williams," he began, glancing at her ticket, which was still on her phone screen. I have spoken to management on the radio. We apologize for the behavior of our employee. She has been suspended from first-class service for this trip. If you require anything, please contact me directly. Amara nodded, her face unreadable. Thank you, she said simply. She didn't need an apology. It didn't change anything, but she appreciated the gesture. James turned to Catherine, who was leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, her eyes hard as stone. He said something quietly to her, and she nodded, but before she left, she cast one last glance at Amara. There was no remorse in it, only cold malice, mixed with something Amara didn't immediately recognize, fear. Catherine knew the video was already circulating online, and her name, her face, her words no longer belonged only to this car. Enjoy your victory, she muttered, so quietly that only Amara heard. Let's see how long it lasts. With that, she turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing down the aisle. James sighed, muttering something like, "Sorry again," and followed her. The door closed, leaving the car in a strange silence. Leah looked up from her phone, her voice cutting through the tension. 10,000 views. The comments are just fire. Someone has already found this company's profile on social media and is demanding an explanation. Amara, do you know you just started a revolution? Amara smiled slightly, but it was a tired smile. She looked out the window, where the darkness behind the glass seemed deeper than before. The train sped forward, the lights flickering like distant stars, but emotions were still churning inside her: anger, relief, the bitter taste of triumph. She took out the necklace with the pendant, clutching it in her hand. The scales of justice felt cold on her skin, reminding her of what she was fighting for. But why was this fight still necessary? Why did she have to prove her right to a place she had honestly earned? The passengers around her began to discuss what was happening. The older man turned to his wife. It's a shame. These days, things like this still happen. The wife nodded, but her voice was quieter. It's her own fault. She could have kept quiet. The man with the laptop finally spoke and threw across the aisle. The company is going to make excuses now. I bet they'll fire her for show. Leah snorted at this. Whether or not she'll be fired, she's already a meme. Someone made a gif of her not for everyone. It's spreading faster than a train can move. Amara listened to all this, but didn't intervene. She opened the book again, but her eyes slid over the lines, not catching on to the meaning. Her phone vibrated, messages from colleagues, friends, even clients who had already seen the video. Are you okay? That was powerful. Let me know if you need support. She turned off the screen without answering. She needed time to process this on her own. The lights of New York City flashed outside the window. The train was approaching the final station. Amara glanced at the free drink card still on the table and pocketed it. Not to use, just as a reminder. The train slowed, and a voice announced the arrival at Grand Central Station. Passengers began to gather, but the air in the car remained heavy, as if everyone was taking a piece of this story with them. Amara stood up, put on her coat, and slung her bag over her shoulder. Leah approached her, holding out her hand. If you need anything, I'm on Twitter at Leah on the line, she said with a smile. That was awesome. You're awesome. Thanks, Leah, Amara said, shaking her hand. You too. She was one of the last to exit the car, feeling the cold air of the station on her face. Her phone vibrated again. The video had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views, and the comments were flowing, from angry, "That's racist," to the snarky, "Catherine, it's time to take a politeness course." There were others. Why did she even start arguing? People are too sensitive. Amara knew this was just the beginning. Tomorrow she would be in the headlines, maybe invited for an interview. But for now, she just wanted to go home. Sitting in the taxi, she looked out at the city lights and thought of Catherine. Her words, "Enjoy your victory," echoed in her head. It was a victory, yes, but why did it feel like nothing had changed? The world had not become a better place in these 12 hours. She still had to prove her place in the courts, on the trains, in life. But when she opened Twitter and saw hundreds of messages of support, condemnation of Catherine, calls for change, something stirred inside her. The fight was on, and it was not pointless. And then she asked herself, and this question is now for you, listeners, how far are we willing to go to change the world? When will people like Catherine realize that the era of impunity is over? Or is this just another stop on the train track where the train stops but never arrives? The story is complete. Amara has won, but she leaves us with questions burning in the comments and in our minds. What would you do in her place? And what will you do now, knowing that Catherines like her are still out there?